During the challenging time of the Great Depression, food was harder to come by than it is today. Food was coveted, as it was in short supply, so to ensure nothing was wasted, this led to innovative food combinations. Let's see how necessity leads to creativity when food is scarce. Hoover stew was an economic meal that was easy to make, so it was quite popular during the Great Depression. Hoover stew was defined by a few traits, and number one was that it could feed a lot of people. The second trait was that it included ingredients that didn't break the budget. This recipe involved many leftovers or scraps that were otherwise ready to expire. You wouldn't need to have a lot of spices to create unique flavors, as you really only need to rely on what you already had. Remember that at that time, America was all but going bankrupt and a lot of people were out of jobs. This stew was cheap to make, but it tasted quite robust, making even taking people's minds off the grave situation they found themselves in. Mock pie was a favorite, and despite there being no apples, it was a reasonably priced version of the beloved traditional apple pie. Apples were getting more expensive and most people didn't have money to buy overpriced produce. You would use Ritz crackers with a common household baking item, and it would create a taste and texture pretty similar to apple pie. To make the crackers sweet, you would use a mixture of vanilla syrup, lemon, and cinnamon. It would give that aroma and taste so familiar you'd swear you were eating an apple pie. It was cheap and easy to make, and saw an explosion in popularity during the Depression and onwards. It was so popular that at one time Ritz had a recipe on the back of the box showing people step by step how to make mock apple pie. It started to lose its appeal once the economy began improving and people became more health conscious, opting for the purity of apples as opposed to the carb-rich crackers. Another economic alternative to feeding a family was cornmeal mush. It was a type of porridge that would fill you up and was served warm, offering up a satisfying meal experience. It was a breakfast replacement that cost a lot less than serving up bacon and eggs. Cornmeal mush was also really healthy, so it gave people energy to go about their day. It was also very versatile because you could add whatever you wanted to it, like nuts, maple syrup, or even a thick sausage gravy. Some would even turn it into small flat squares and fry them up. While it was a common dish during the Depression, it did not stand the test of time once people could afford other options. Dandelions were a welcome weed during the Great Depression because they could replace lettuce for making salad. For those who weren't working, to which there were many, they could go out scavenging for dandelions to make a side dish. This is a reflection of what those desperate times called for. While it was free, it took a lot of work as you would have to cut the roots and flowers. Then you'd have to wash them well to get any dirt off. It was garnished with a simple lemon and olive oil for a bit of taste. While it was pretty plain as a side dish or meal, it was extremely healthy and gave people valuable nutrients that they were struggling to find. Vinegar pie was another popular dish served up during the Depression. It was particularly popular in Pennsylvania during the beginning of the 1930s. Back then, every woman in a household could make a pie crust, so it didn't cost much to create the foundations. Other basic ingredients included, vinegar, sugar, and eggs. The taste itself was pretty dull, which is why the pie would be covered in a tempting meringue. This pie was often made for special occasions and events. While it did have a sour taste from the vinegar, it was accompanied with some sweetness. To add some excitement to the sweet dish, people would often drizzle meringue with honey or cinnamon. Potatoes were easy to grow, and even if you couldn't grow them, they were one of the most reasonable vegetables to purchase. They were hearty and could feed a family by adding a few different ingredients and could cater to every family member's needs. It was certainly a welcome addition for the breakfast options during the Great Depression. You would peel and shred the potatoes and then strain all the liquid out. From there, you'd shape them into pancakes and add any ingredients you had. This was one of the meals during the Great Depression that tasted like it cost a lot but was actually very cheap to make. They took a bit of time to make with more steps than people were willing to take, so potato pancakes would eventually take a back seat to more convenient foods later on. Some produce was cheaper than others, and were widely utilized during these hard times in the 1920s and 1930s. One example of this is prunes, which were dried plums, and while they may be considered a Great Depression favorite, Teddy D. Roosevelt was known for loving this dessert as well. Americans felt that it was good enough for the president, it would certainly be good enough for them. It was simple and easy to make as long as you soaked the prunes in water overnight. You'd add some syrups of your choice with butter and sugar to create the delicious, rich dessert. During a time where desserts were hard to come by, this recipe was common in many households. This Depression-era recipe may not have looked appealing, but it was healthy, hearty, and cheap to make. Haluski, or cabbage and noodles, was a diverse meal that called for noodles of your choice and cabbage, and each household had their own version of the dish. It was one of the most common recipes circulating during the Great Depression for those living on the lowest of budgets. It was also a great way to ensure that you used up any produce that would otherwise become inedible, and one of the true hero recipes of the time. Bean soup was known as the recipe for hard times and was originally used in the Navy. Not only is it cheap to make, it's also easy. You would add dried red kidney beans and add it to a soup where it would eventually thicken from the beans. You could add whatever you wanted to it, like onions, carrots, celery, and any herb to add taste. Fred Du Bois, Idaho's senator, passed a bill that mandated that the Senate restaurant to always include bean soup on their menu daily. This ultimately started the movement, and as households caught wind of the recipe, it became an American favorite. In an era where people were desperate to fill themselves up with healthy foods, milk toast was a popular snack. Bread was toasted and then dipped in milk and then fried until golden brown, and then you would spread some butter over it. As you can probably tell, it was extremely easy to make and offered more taste than just having a piece of boring toast. As people were looking for variety at a time where there wasn't much food in the house, milk toast was a way to mix up your breakfast options. Another toast option was a little more robust in taste, was creamed chipped beef on toast. For upper middle class households, there was still little supply, so cooking with beef steak on a barbecue would have been scarce. For those who know how to smoke meat, this was a cheap and easy breakfast dish to create. It had the taste of a barbecue with an added creamy sauce. All you needed was a few thin pieces of smoked meat along with the ingredients to make a creamy white sauce. Along with milk, flour, and butter, you could also add items like cayenne pepper to make the flavors pop. It was a wonderful food invention that gave a taste of satisfaction that was hard to find in these difficult times. Oatmeal cakes was a sweet and earthy snack that conjured up feelings of warmth. It was something you'd have as a child when you went to grandma's house. It was also very cheap and easy ingredients that most people would have in their pantry. Along with oatmeal, you could add raisins, cinnamon, sugar, and maple syrup to make it even more interesting. It only took 35 minutes to make oatmeal cakes, so it was a good option if people were popping in the last minute. In the traditional recipe, you would find an almond or peanut butter topping and was considered a healthy dessert. Depression cake was a recipe that didn't require too many ingredients. It wasn't easy or cheap to have luxury items like milk and eggs and butter in your home. This cake would be created without any of those items. You would use flour, cacao powder, vanilla, powdered sugar, and salt and water, making it a realistic dessert that nearly any household could afford. With the crash in the 1920s, all the usual cake ingredients were extremely expensive and people were out of jobs. It was the bakeries that came up with an alternative way to make a moist chocolate cake and named it Depression Cake. The Depression Cake was the foundation for other creative ways to make desserts for far less and was said to inspire recipes like mock apple pie. The mock food trend was popular during the Depression, but as it's no longer necessary, the recipe has faded to history. Potato soup would vary in taste depending on the ingredients you could spare. It could be anything from very basic to quite hearty for those who had the luxury of having herbs in the kitchen. Basic ingredients were used including carrots, celery, garlic, and herbs. If you had butter and milk, you could add them before adding any liquids. Salt, pepper, and water were the ingredients for the household soup stock, and you could add sliced potatoes. During this terrible time in history, potato soup was served for special occasions and something to get excited about. Today, it would be considered a most basic type of soup, but tastes great nonetheless. Apple Brown Betty was one of the premier desserts of the Depression and was made of pie crust originally. The Depression recipe called for breadcrumbs from old bread, so it was just a great way to make use of the ingredients that would otherwise go to waste. By adding brown sugar, you could create a sweet, crunchy topping over a few valued apples. Everybody would make Apple Brown Betty differently, just depending on what they had as a topping. This is what made it somewhat unique and interesting. Nowadays, there's no need to save up old breadcrumbs to make a dessert anymore, but many of the modern recipes derive from this original idea. And there you have it. Which recipe would you be willing to try today? Thank you so much for watching, and we hope to see you in the next video.